Welcome to Mastering Agility. If you want to listen to authentic conversations with the most inspiring guests, find like-minded people in the Mastering Agility Discord community, or both online and face-to-face events, this is the platform for you. Grab a drink, sit back, and join professional Scrum trainers Sander Dorr, Jim Sammons, and their guests in an all-new episode.
Hey everyone, if you've ever wanted to join Sander and I in person and maybe even record a podcast episode of your own or just sit in a panel and talk to some guests, this is your chance. We're both going to be in Helsinki, Finland at the end of March on March 27th and 28th at the Scan Agile Conference. The venue looks amazing. There's plenty of awesome speakers, sites, food, and other activities to experience while you're in town. What I'm excited about the most, besides the conference, of course, is learning some of these great Finnish phrases. Like apparently in Finland, they don't say that they're in a great hurry. They say they're going to run using their head as a third leg. Now, we all know that Sander can be a bit crazy at times, but a Finn would question if he has all of the moomins in his valley. I have no idea what that means, but I'm going to say that no, he doesn't have all of his movements. So come on, join us. It's going to be great. All the info is at scan-agile.org. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Mastering Agility. You've got Jim today. Our co-host Sander is otherwise busy with some client work, and we've got Marge in studio, and our guest today is none other than Phil Agnew. And before I turn it over to Phil to introduce himself, I will just say that the listeners of this podcast have known I'm a huge fan of Nudge, and I will admit, and Marge is probably going to laugh at me, that I've been fanboying over this episode for a while because I couldn't wait to talk to Phil. And if you follow us on LinkedIn, you'll see I threw a bat signal up in December to try and get his attention. So it's great that we were able to make this happen. So Phil, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Jim. And I feel like you used a few nudges to even get me on in your emails to me. I was like, oh, I'm being persuaded here. I'm being influenced. So kudos for applying some of the things I think I try and teach. And thank you so much for having me on. I'm really excited for today.
Absolutely. So, Phil, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you at? What do you do? How do you spend your time with the podcast and other pursuits?
So I host Nudge, and Nudge is the UK's number one marketing podcast, a top 20 marketing podcast in the US. And Nudge really is not just about marketing, it's about behavioral science and psychology. So on the show, I interview these experts, these psychology, behavioral science experts, best-selling authors who deeply understand how the human mind works. They teach me how people make decisions, why people do one action over another, and then I try and apply some of those findings to marketing. So in Nudge, I will take some of the world's best behavioral science principles and apply them to marketing itself. So that's basically what I'm doing with Nudge, and I have great fun doing it as well. Awesome.
So on the podcast, you mentioned a part of the HubSpot network. So can you talk for a second about kind of what the relationship is with HubSpot? I think some of our listeners are probably familiar with their offerings.
Yeah, HubSpot are the exclusive advertisers of my show. And I mean, I'm paid to say this, but I really do think they're fantastic. I've always loved HubSpot. I've been a marketer for over a decade now, a marketer who desperately struggled at the start of my career and have started to make sense of the crazy and difficult world, which is marketing now, 10 years on. But HubSpot, I've always really admired. I think they were the origins behind this sort of inbound content marketing strategy, which anyone who was in marketing in 2013, 14 probably tried to copy, especially if you were in SaaS or tech. So they were really influential. I've always really admired them. And when I had the opportunity, I think 3 years ago, to join their podcast network, I jumped at it because I knew that HubSpot really have produced some of the best marketing content over the past decade. Their event, Inbound, I think is the best marketing event on the planet. So I'm really happy to be part of their network and work with those folks.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. As a listener of your podcast, one of the things that I always find myself wondering is there some amount of either diminishing returns or negative value that could be had from stacking these techniques? So the techniques I hear you talk to your guests about could range from something as simple as bolding words in a sentence of an email to call the reader's attention to it. to some really deeply held psychological and bias-based patterns. So what do you think? Like, is there an amount that's too much? Is there an amount that's too little when it comes to influencing people?
It depends. Classic podcast answer. It depends. But it really does depend. It really does. So yeah, basically with applying these nudges, if you are applying them to a certain field, you might want to only pick one. So let's say, for example, I'm trying to improve the emails I'm sending. There is a lot of evidence that cognitive load, i.e., the amount people have to read, drastically reduces the likelihood that they'll take action. So if you send an email to someone that contains 500 words, it's far less likely that they will click or answer the survey or do the thing you want them to do than if you just say 140 words, for example. That's just one nudge. Now, there are other nudges that would say if you told a really compelling story or perhaps showcased all of your effort, you could also influence them that way. But that would obviously mean increasing your words. So that's an example of where they contradict each other, and what you would need to do is an A/B test to figure out what works. But I think there are other areas where compounding, adding these nudges on top of each other, and just to share for the listeners, by nudge, I'm using a very specific term, but using it quite generally. So I'm basically saying applying psychology to marketing is when I refer to that. But let's take a different example, which is a menu. So when you go into a restaurant, there are lots of subtle small nudges on a menu, depending on what restaurant you're in, which will encourage you to buy more. So for example, usually a menu, if you're at a wine bar, a fancy wine bar in Soho in London especially, will have a very expensive wine listed towards the top of the menu. So it won't be listed in price order. You won't see a nice cheap bottle of house wine for 15 quid at the top of the menu. No, you will see a very expensive, perhaps even bottle of champagne listed at £150, and then you'll see other prices beneath that. The reason they do that is due to anchoring. Now, this is the idea that the initial piece of information we see influences our perception. So if we look at a menu and the first price we see is £150, we think, God, that's expensive. But then when we see a wine for £35, we think, well, that's quite reasonably priced compared to the top one. If instead we went to a menu and the first wine was priced at £15, then saw one for £35, the £35 would look more expensive. So menus often use anchoring, but then they also use subtle other biases as well. Framing is a good example. So Sybil Yang, a researcher, has conducted studies that have looked at whether removing the currency symbol from a menu actually increases people's likelihood to buy. This doesn't work everywhere, but at luxury stores, and you will have seen this if you've been to a fancy wine bar, for example, they won't actually put the dollar sign or the price sign. They remove that partly to give this feeling of exclusivity, but also just to make sure that you are not thinking about price when you're looking at the menu. It's just one of these reframing things that makes you more likely to spend more. So that's anchoring combined with framing. And then you can have another one on there as well. So some restaurants, might be a wine bar, if we stick with that example, will say something like, this is the most popular. There's a reason they would do this. Richard Shotton in 2018 in his book, The Choice Factory, went into a London pub, asked the bartender, what is your most popular beer? The bartender said it's London Pride, which is a pretty common, fairly cheap London beer. It's nice. And Richard said, well, can I put a sign in front of that beer for the next week, which simply tells people this is the most popular beer? Barman agrees. They run this little experiment. For that week, the sales of the London Pride dramatically increase. But interestingly, sales of other beers don't go down. So what he found was that simply stating that a beer is popular made people more likely to buy more volume of that beer, which wasn't even reducing the total revenue the pub was making. So it was increasing sales just with the subtle nudge. And that is the idea of social proof. We follow the actions of other people. This is sort of something we learned as cavemen. If people were running out of a cave, cavemen were running out of a cave, you wouldn't go in that cave. You think, oh, there's some angry wolves in there. So you'd run away with them. And we do the same thing today. When we see that a beer is most popular in London, we think, oh, maybe I should try one of those. Or actually, maybe I should get a couple because they're really popular. So we follow the actions of others. So if you put a most popular sign on your menu, it will increase sales in a similar way and perhaps not even drop them. So especially if a side, like a starter or a side, is most popular on your menu, maybe a dessert as well. It might encourage additional purchases. So you can stack these nudges if you're in the right context. On an email, that's something that's very specific. It might be hard to do this, but with most things, a website, a menu, product packaging, an advert, you can layer on lots of these different nudges and try and build up to a place where they're having a really good effect.
Yeah. And for our listeners, one of the ways I've applied just the simplest of these concepts, and Marge and I are currently working together, and she's probably seen me do this, is I will bold some words in an email because I want to call users' attention to that, or readers' attention. But Phil, what I think I remember from the Nudge episode about this idea was when you do that, you will get more attention to those bolded items at the expense of almost everything else in that message. Is that correct?
Yeah, this is research by a Harvard professor called Todd Rogers. He wrote a book called Writing Made Simple, something like that. A really good book with a co-author. We can link to it in the show notes, I'm sure. And he explained all of these studies behind copywriting and specifically around emails. And he found, like you said, that when you bold items in your email, you do draw attention to it. But when people are later asked in studies to read these emails, one with bolding and one without, what you find is the people who have read an email with bolded text within it, so lines bolded, stuff like that, just like you said, Jim, they remember the bolded text more than the people who read the email without the bolded text. But overall, those who read the bolded text remembered less of the email in its entirety. So if you're actually writing an email which is trying to get multiple points across, say you're emailing a set of parents at a school and you need to tell them a lot of information about all the upcoming extracurriculum classes, you probably shouldn't use bold, because what that will do is it will draw their attention to some of the classes, make them forget the other ones. And what you really need is recall across all of them. So it can backfire. It's an interesting study in that sense. But then there are much more interesting ways you can apply behavioral science as well. For example, bolding is kind of normal. Everybody does that. Nobody's going to listen to this and think, oh, Phil's a real marketing genius telling me to bold or not bold some email.
Right.
And a more interesting thing to do would be to perhaps write a handwritten note or record a video of yourself actually talking through the video. There are ways and things you can put into your email to really make you stand out and to try and achieve some of the things you want to achieve.
Right. Could you define, if someone asks you on the tube, let's say, to define influence, what does it mean to influence? What would your response be?
Let me guess. It depends.
If someone asked me on the tube to define influence, I would run away. Piss off. Don't talk to me. Bloody Londoners. We're not meant to talk to each other. Get away from me, you weirdo. And you want me to define influence? No. So I'd be very scared. I'd be sweating profusely. But maybe if they cornered me, because in the London tubes, it's quite difficult to go between carriages. So maybe if they caught me at the end of the carriage and really cornered me, I might be pressured into an answer. And I would maybe, if I wanted to maybe be quite eloquent, I would talk to them about the Milgram study, famous Stanley Milgram study of the 1960s, which I think showcased influence in its finest. So obviously influence is this idea that you can use your power, your authority, your likability to make somebody do something that they wouldn't otherwise do. And Stanley Milgram showed this in the 1960s with a now very notorious, infamous experiment, which has had some repetition problems, but in general is widely accepted. And this experiment was inspired by the treatment of German people under the Nazi regime. Stanley Milgram couldn't really understand why people acted the way they did. Why did Germans give in to this regime? And he ran this study to showcase the power of authority. And in the study, random participants, people like me and you, were brought into a lab and were asked to essentially be answering quiz questions from another participant who was behind a wall. So the other participant would be asked a quiz question. We would check their answer. And if they get it right, we would say, fantastic, you got it right. If they got it wrong, we would have to give them an electric shock. And we were told as we went into this experiment that the electric shocks ranged in voltage. The smallest volt would be just a sort of small tingle that you might feel. The medium volt would be something quite painful. The highest volt, they were told, could potentially be deadly. And what Stanley Milgram wanted to find out was, would these people participating in this study ever get to the point where they could deliver deadly voltage? And what he tested in particular was how much authority played a role in whether people did or did not deliver those deadly voltage. So in one of the scenarios, people were told by a fellow researcher, okay, now you have to deliver 450 volts, for example, because they'd got repeated questions wrong. And that researcher wasn't wearing a white lab coat, just looked like a normal person. When they looked like a normal person, nobody gave the 450 voltage. Nobody gave a deadly amount of voltage. If you're just being told to do something by someone who looks like you, they don't really have any influence. They won't be able to influence you. However, when they were told by a Yale scientist wearing a white lab coat, 66% of the participants gave voltages all the way up to the top amount. Now, that number, 66%, is questioned, and we don't know if it's actually that high. And I should just clarify that nobody was actually getting electrocuted here. It was an actor on the other side of the wall. And although the actor made very convincing noises that they were being frazzled, they weren't actually being frazzled. No people were harmed in the making of that experiment. But it really showcased for the first time the power of influence, how just wearing a white lab coat can encourage people to do something they wouldn't otherwise want to do. And that is why today, Oral-B, for example, advertised their toothbrush by saying 9 out of 10 dentists would pick this toothbrush, and the dentist will always be wearing a white lab coat. There is a reason why they use those people. It's because they have more influence. It's why George Clooney advertised for Nespresso. He has no coffee making ability, as far as I can tell. But he has influence due to his popularity and his likability. So for me, that is influence. It is the ability to make somebody do something that they wouldn't otherwise do. But the more interesting side of it is that you can get influence in all sorts of ways. It's not just the amount of followers you have on Instagram. It could simply be you wearing a white lab coat versus not wearing a white lab coat.
Mastering agility only works with organizations aligned with our values, and that's exactly why we are excited to work with our sponsor. Scrum Match is the free platform for professionals run by professionals. On Scrum Match, true Scrum Masters get hired by companies serious about the popular framework. The awesome people behind this platform have decades of experience, among them a professional Scrum trainer for Scrum.org. They have interviewed, trained, and coached hundreds of like-minded people, and they use this exact experience to make you stand out from the crowd and help you get in touch with companies looking for true Scrum Masters. So go to scrummatch.com and sprint to your dream job.
Yeah, and I think we see this a lot in social engineering. Like I was reading something yesterday about how a person had a very sought after Twitter handle back in the days before X, and it was called Twitter. And a hacker was able to use some extremely simple and pedestrian social engineering tactics to basically, in the matter of 2 hours, take control of this thing, hold it hostage, hold their entire web presence hostage. Something that was valued, a Twitter handle back then was a marketing tool. It still is, but it was even more so then. But it was influence, right? They were influencing other people's. And I think the key phrase that I'm hearing you say a few times is getting someone to do something they wouldn't normally do. Now, I've heard you talk a lot with guests about the ethics of things. I've read the works from Cialdini, and in Persuasion, he talks a lot at the beginning about the ethics around influence. So it's 2025. We're bombarded with, the American election, all the political issues around the world. Where do you land on kind of the ethics of nudges and influence in general?
Well, let's start at the very basic. Every marketer, salesperson, business leader has to make decisions about how they present themselves and their product. For example, say you're selling yogurt. The yogurt contains 5% fat. You have to make a decision. You have to show that because that's legal. You have to make a decision about how you share that. You either say 5% fat or you say 95% fat free. Now, both of those things are true. Some might call one of them a nudge, but the point is you have to make a decision. Everything is a nudge. You can't avoid it in a way in some cases. There's the great study cited in Richard Thaler's book, Nudge, which I named my podcast after, which was in the Google cafeteria. And he showed in this amazing study that people are nudged in all sorts of directions, even if you don't want them to be. For example, if you put fruit at eye level, they're more likely to pick fruit. If you put bottled water behind opaque glass, they're less likely to pick bottled water and more likely to pick soda. If you then switch it around, they're more likely to pick the bottled water. People are always nudged in one way or the other. It would be naive to think that as business leaders, marketers, advertisers, that we should not think about nudging because it's unethical. Well, no, it's not. That's not going to avoid the problem. We'll still be nudging people in one way or the other. One will just not be without conscious thought. And the conscious thought is maybe where there's a sort of second tier level of discussion that we need to have, which is if you are consciously trying to influence someone and consciously trying to change their behavior, you have to ask yourself a few questions. Firstly, you should probably ask yourself, how would I feel if I was influenced to take the behavior that I am trying to nudge people towards? So if I'm trying to get my guests to read a book that I think will be beneficial for them, and I'm using a few, my listeners to read a book that I think will be influential for them, and I'm using a few nudges to try and encourage them to do that, I should then ask myself, well, would I want to read that book? Would I actually enjoy reading this book and get benefit from it? And the answer would be yes. So I think I would if it's something that I genuinely think is worthwhile reading. So it's a pretty easy one to say, well, it's worthwhile doing a bit of influence there. You should probably also ask yourself, well, how would you feel if a family member experienced the same thing? Would you be happy for your sister, your mother, your brother, your father to go through the same thing? And if the answer is yes, then it's probably okay. So the difference there is if you are trying to nudge people to do something that you think you wouldn't want to do yourself, you probably shouldn't be using these biases and you should stay clear, and you probably shouldn't be influencing people. And then we're just falling into sort of the most classic debate on morality that you can imagine, which is should you do to other people that you wouldn't do to yourself or to your neighbor, that sort of thing. And I think the rules here are just common rules that we all know. Don't do bad things, don't be evil, sort of thing. And the same applies to behavior science. Just because we understand how people make decisions doesn't mean automatically that, you're some evil overlord who's going to change everybody's decision. It's much more difficult than that. All it means is that you should just pay attention to making sure that you don't get people to do things that you wouldn't want to do.
So what's your take on, for example, if I think about the regular consumer, let's say I go to the bar in Soho and I see I'm being influenced by, for example, the expensive champagne on top of the menu. That I feel is still okay because I'm an adult. I can still make a conscious decision. I might be influenced. But then, for example, over here in Germany, we have quite a bit of discussion going on if it's still ethical to advertise specific products to kids. So, for example, print the little funny bunny on it or stuff like that, and then set it on the area on the ground, near the ground where the kids can see it, or right in front of the checkout so the kids can grab it. It's all super colorful. What's your take on that? Because those kids aren't really the conscious consumers, yet they are being influenced. How do you feel about that?
I think you've hit on a really good thing, which is that children don't have maybe the same agency that adults have to make a balanced decision. We know that children are far more likely to be persuaded, especially by authority figures. When you go into a bar in Soho, nobody is forcing your decision. You are not being forced in one way or the other. You might be subtly nudged. That's why it's called a nudge, but you are not being forced. You could, I think, make a point that when you put children-based junk food at a checkout till at a supermarket, the child will be influenced to such a degree that they are almost being forced to buy this thing. They will feel unable to not try and pick up and persuade their parents to buy one of these things. So I think advertising to children is very dangerous. I think also, that this is maybe a wider problem with capitalism, right? Which is a crazy thing to be getting into 20 minutes into a marketing podcast. But fundamentally, the idea of capitalism is that we give people a free market and we give business leaders a free market to try and make as much profit as possible. That's what they are incentivized to do. And the way capitalism works is that you have regulations and rules in place to rein that in when it goes too far. So in the UK, the UK government has banned sweets at checkout stalls in grocery stores and supermarkets. So when you go to the checkout, it's only healthy food and I think chewing gum there now. We have also banned, I believe, junk food ads on daytime TV. So if you're watching TV before 9 p.m., you will not see an advert for KFC, McDonald's and Burger King. Now, that doesn't mean that Burger King were technically immoral by advertising before 9 p.m., it just means that the regulation is sort of catching up with the amount of damage that influence can do. If we understand that advertising junk food before 9 p.m. could cause an obesity crisis that could potentially have detrimental effects on the health service in the UK, and of course on all the people who are eating too much fast food, then you can create a regulation like that to take in place. But I think I don't see that as a problem with behavioral science and marketing and nudging. I see that as if people don't like that business leaders want to grow their profits, the problem lies with capitalism, not some of the tactics that they use. There's no other way around it. Business leaders will always be incentivized to offer a cheaper price, to offer better quality, to try and create something that will make it more enticing to buy. So it's a difficult one. It's a tricky one, but I think ultimately behavioral science wouldn't be the thing that is influencing, is really pushing the needle there. The problem lies with something at a higher level.
I think it comes back to, we could probably sum all that up by don't hate the player, hate the game, which the game is capitalism. Businesses are in business to make money for themselves and their shareholders. And Phil, something you probably don't know about me, but I was an obese child. And could I blame 1980s American TV? And it's funny because if you go to YouTube now, you'll see all these historical videos of like adverts from the 1980s. And I'm like, well, no wonder I was, unhealthy and sitting in front of 4 hours of cartoons with every sugary, sweet soda, cereal you can imagine. But as an adult now, who does what I do and help the companies that produce those products produce better products, it falls to my parents. It falls to me to make personal decisions. And I can complain about the system, but I think some degree of personal accountability is always at play. And Marge, to your point, like that child usually, sometimes they can't pick that thing up and go pay for it and go home. But I think as someone who's worked with consumer product companies, they're building future customers. They're creating habits. They're nudging an 8-year-old now, knowing that in about 4 or 5 years, that kid will have money in their pocket and be able to go in and become a customer. And I'm meandering my way to a question, but my question, Phil, is at doing what you do and having the guests on that you do and all the reading, I'm wondering if you enjoy that you are now much more aware of nudges and influence in your day-to-day life, or if you actually kind of wish you could go back to maybe not being as aware. Because one thing we talk about in this podcast a lot is I see things every day, all day, that I can apply what I do for my clients to things. And at times I wish I could just go to the movies and enjoy the new Marvel movie and not see the advertising and not understand the queuing systems whereby I buy the ticket to get into my seat and not see all the nudges before the movie ever starts. Sometimes I wish I could go back and being ignorant of those things. What do you think? Like, do you ever have that desire, I guess, to become more ignorant of some of this?
I still feel extremely ignorant, and I still feel incredibly naive. And Danny Kahneman, the famous Nobel laureate who wrote the book Thinking Fast and Slow, one of the pioneers behind behavioral science and nudges, famously said that even though he literally wrote the book on the thing, he felt no more immune to nudges and persuasion attempts than anybody else. There is some research to suggest that if you learn more about some of the tactics that people use to potentially influence you, you'll be better at resisting that. We're viewing houses at the moment, and I am picking up on all of the small little subtle things the real estate agents do, the little ways they say, oh, I'm sure this wouldn't be too bad. The little nudges they use to just persuade you to buy a house, which is potentially falling apart. But even so, I think I probably pick up on far too little of it. And it's more, the frustration is more that when I review my behavior and I think, why did I just spend 30 quid at that restaurant? Or why did I buy my friends that expensive round of beers? There's a lot of restaurant food examples here. But when I think back to that, I probably think, I was nudged by that offer, wasn't I? That 2-for-1 offer. Or I was really persuaded by that a fellow person who I saw in the restaurant ordering that meal or something like that. So I might reflect on my behavior, but I definitely don't feel as if I'm this sort of superhuman who can resist all of these nudges. Nobody can. To give the listeners a bit of a backstory, because we've been getting extremely detailed very early, and I think it's sometimes good just to get some high level understanding of what we're talking about here. The idea that Danny Kahneman introduced, and this is not necessarily scientific understanding of our brain, because nobody deeply understands how our brain works, but it is a good analogy for how the brain works, is he basically said, Danny Kahneman said, there are two modes of thinking. System one, this is the first mode of thinking, and this is very fast and unconscious. This is the thinking that we do when we're driving in a car. We never think about where we put our feet, about how we're changing the gears, about where the indicator is or where the wind. We do it all automatically. We operate completely on autopilot. And we do this for the vast majority of our decisions. According to some research, around 95% of our decisions every day are based on this system one mode of thinking, this fluent mode of thinking. How we will open an app on our phone, answer an email, what we will say to the cashier, what we'll pick up when we're at the checkout of a supermarket store, what we'll decide to cook for dinner. Most of these thoughts are using system one. And then for 5% of our decisions, we use system two, which is slow, thoughtful, and deliberate. That's the sort of system that you might engage when you actually decide to buy a house or accept a job offer, or perhaps have a difficult conversation with someone. That's when you really engage your critical mind. And Daniel Kahneman basically says that when we are in system one, we will use heuristics, shortcuts to make decisions. So when we're making a system one decision, which might be, we're walking down the beachfront in Greece on holiday, where should we go to eat tonight? We'll probably use a system one decision. We will look down the beachfront and we'll see that one restaurant has a nice big queue outside. We'll think, well, that's popular, social proof. Let's go join that queue, get in line for that restaurant. It's just a shortcut. We didn't do a rational analysis of all of the restaurants. It would have taken too long. We used a shortcut to make that decision. And because the majority of decisions are made by system one, it would be impossible for people to become immune to nudges and behavioral science, because you can't be immune to something that is automatic and fast and so quick to process. That would be like saying that Lewis Hamilton, a Formula One driver, is constantly thinking about how he's pushing the pressure on the pedal, how he's driving a car, how he's taking each corner, because he don't know so much about driving. Hell no, of course not. When he drives to work, he just drives like the rest of us, totally on autopilot, probably isn't a very good driver. I'm sure there's some studies to say that F1 drivers are actually just as bad at actually driving a normal car as the rest of us. Don't quote me on that, but that's what I imagine. So that's why learning about nudges won't actually make you immune and unable, this sort of a monk-like figure when you're walking around a grocery store, not picking up any junk food. Of course it won't. You spend too much of your life in system one to ever get to that level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is there a mismatch principle between when we apply system one thinking to things that maybe we should apply deeper thinking to, like buying a house? Like, it feels like a mismatch in either direction could lead to a problem. If you impulsively buy a house tomorrow based on shortcuts, you're probably giving in to influence nudges. There's probably a lot of emotional reasons there. But so how would someone guard against how they're reacting to something? Or are we able to? Are we not even able to do that? Is that not something that can be learned?
Well, there is a book out at the moment by Gert Geigenhanser and colleagues, which is called Smart Management, where he and his colleagues actually suggest that people should embrace their heuristics, their system one mode of thinking, because he's got a lot of evidence that suggests the sort of gut reaction we have, the immediate shortcut we take, tends to be a very accurate way to make decisions. Deciding to go to the restaurant with a queue outside the front door is smart. You can't really fake that as a company. You can't fake, of course, you could pay actors to stand outside your front door, but the chances a company would do that is very slim. And even if they did that, it probably suggests that their food is quite good, because if they can afford to pay actors to stand outside their front door, they can probably afford to have fairly decent food. So relying on system one can actually be quite a good thing. And this is also where I did say at the start of that system one, system two is not actually the way the brain works. The brain is far more complex, and often with decisions which are so clearly system two, which have been thought through, you'll find that people have maybe made judgments or quick analysis or adopted a point of view which is solely based on system one. We see this all the time with politics. People decide to vote for someone and give all these amazing reasons as to why they want to vote for them, but the real reason might just be because they're taller or more attractive than the other candidate. There's a lot of evidence to prove that that's the case. Another example, we've been mentioning a lot about buying houses. There's this wonderful example in which Rory Sutherland, who's a Ogilvy ad man and just all-round intelligent bloke, he did a talk at Nudgestock recently where he spoke about, or gave this example of a couple who had quadruplets, I believe. So just sort of suddenly had a very big family and needed a new home. And they really wanted to buy a house on a specific street, which I believe was very close to their family. Nobody was selling a house on that street. There was only about 20 houses on the street. So what do you do? Well, most people would just say, well, there's nothing for sale. What can we do? They really wanted to buy a house on that street. So what they did is they hand wrote a letter to every single house on the street, personalized the letter explaining who they were and why they wanted to buy a house. What happened after that is rather incredible. Most people ignored the letter, of course, as you would, but I think 9 people called them back. So a number did call them back, mainly just to say, oh, good luck with your search. That's quite nice. 5 people actually did invite them around to view the house. 3 people made them accepted an offer from them, and then they ended up buying one of the houses. Now, Rory makes the point that is an incredible act of influence. Something as huge as leaving your home would be usually the process of an incredible amount of system 2 thinking. And I'm sure there was system 2 thinking in the process, in the minds of all these people that sold their house or offered to sell their house. But the important thing here is they were persuaded by something which is probably very system 1. The idea that because this person took the time to write a handwritten letter, we should really take the time to take their request seriously. They've been really nice in writing this letter for us. We should invite them around. Oh, because they're around, we should give them a proper tour. Oh, because we're giving them a proper tour, maybe we should actually ask them how much they'll buy the house for. Oh, that offer's quite good. Let's sell our house. And suddenly a small heuristic decision, which just came from a system 1 mode of thinking, has led to this very much what people describe as a system 2 decision. So there's a lot of crossover in this, and it's too simplistic to view the world as system 1 and system 2. But the important thing, I think, for the listeners to remember is that you can influence decisions using these shortcuts. And if you understand them, if you understand how people make decisions, you can have some rather drastic impacts on the influence you'll have on the world. And that could be encouraging someone to vote for a specific politician or sell their house.
Both Jim and I are experienced consultants and trainers. Therefore, we know how important it is for organizations to have the fundamentals in place before delivering high-value products. And this starts with understanding the theory behind whatever framework, method, or process organizations apply. And this is where Xebia comes in. Xebia is a pioneering software engineering and IT consultancy company, transforming and executing at the intersection of domain and technology to create digital leaders for our people, clients, partners, and communities. As a gift for our Mastering Agility audience, they provided us with a discount code MA10 when signing up for their open enrollment classes to get 10% off. Go to xebia.com/academy to find the entire curriculum of courses. That is Xebia, xebia.com/academy to find all their courses.
And Marge and I, and many of our listeners, our businesses could be summed up as organizational change. I say at least once a week, if not more. Companies don't call me, they don't hire me, they don't hire people like Marge and I if they just want to keep doing what they've always done, which means by them saying we want to change means we're going to change behavior. So that's why I love the podcast, because I feel like I'm in the business of nudges, but it's not to get people to buy things, it's to change their behavior. So that's just, I want to put that out there if there's a listener saying, I love everything I'm hearing from Phil, but Jim, why is this important to me? I think that's part of my why. And I want to come back to the Soho example is because I'm thinking about my last couple of weeks, and Marge and I we've produced a number of documents. We've made some videos. We've attended a lot of meetings. We're doing a lot of different modalities in any given week. But who at a restaurant would be the one who's looking at the menu to say, let's add that little icon in front of that bottle, or let's take the euro symbol off the menu? And then the follow-on question is, if you know, I would love to hear, who do you think is doing these things inside of large companies? Like, obviously with like a consumer products company, they have armies of UI, UX, marketing, communication type people, but how does that apply to your average company, average department that maybe doesn't have access to those people, but they would like to benefit from some of these concepts?
Well, I mean, it could really be anyone. And I think a lot of the best sort of nudges that you see businesses apply tend to come not from scientists or experts or outside consultants. They come from individuals who have been working within a field for so long, perhaps family business, that they deeply understand how people make decisions. There's a famous sandwich bar in New York. I think it's called Katz. Sam Tatum talks about it in his book Evolutionary Ideas. I wish I'd been. It would be nice to say I've been to the sandwich bar in New York. I haven't. I guess
I've been there. It's wonderful.
You've been here. So do you know what it isn't the deal? And I'm hoping this is true, that the walls are covered with either loyalty cards or pictures of their customers. It's something like that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you'll see that at a lot of very successful places. Like the Carnegie Deli in New York is famous for that. The Billy Goat Tavern in Chicago, Katz's Delicatessen in New York. So yes, the short answer is yes. Social proof, celebrity social proof.
But who initially decided to do that? It wasn't McKinsey. McKinsey didn't go into this sandwich deli and say, I can't remember what it is. Let's just say it's sticking up pictures of your customers. It's probably just the owner at some point thought, that's a nice idea. And then realized once it was up there that people became kind of infatuated that and the queues started filling out the door. You sort of intuitively sometimes know that if I have a load of pictures on my walls of customers looking really happy, when a new customer comes in, they will immediately trust this place more because they will see that other customers have been here and have had a good experience. If you're new to New York, you'll know that you're in a very popular historic establishment when you go into Katz without them having to say a single thing to you. So I think a lot of these things come intuitively through the end. I mean, there's this wonderful, I just did an interview with these two authors of a book called The Housefly Effect. And the Housefly Effect is literally named after a fly that was painted on toilets, urinals. So this was originally painted in a urinal back in Stratford-upon-Avon in the 1800s. And the reason they painted it was actually a little wasp or bee, was a joke. Because basically, the Latin word for fly or bee, I'm not sure, it's one of them, was apis. And obviously in British, apis means something else. It just means literally taking a leak. And so it was a joke that they would paint these flies on urinals. But at some point, apparently the story goes, hasn't been scientifically tested, but this is the story, somebody realized that if you paint the fly in the right place, you will reduce splashback and cleanup costs because you can actually encourage people to aim at the right place. And more importantly, the fly gives guys something to aim at, which they will always do when there is something to aim at on a urinal, apparently. And they are subtly nudged to basically create less splashback. And this was applied at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. They've painted all these flies in the exact right spot of their urinals. And the story goes that cleanup dropped by 50% and that cleaning costs were halved. Now, there needs to be a scientific study to actually back that up rather than just anecdotes. But it is an example of a nudge, a principle, an idea coming totally from random, from some people in Stratford-upon-Avon who are having a little joke about painting a fly because the Latin word for it is apis, broadening and following on to an airport, reading about the story and thinking that they can apply it in quite an interesting way. I don't know who in particular would do that, but the point is, I guess, that this doesn't just come from consultants and experts. It can come from intuitive thoughts from family owners or historic examples of flies in urinals. It can come from anywhere, and that's the real beauty of behavioral science. It doesn't have to be something which is only learnt about in the textbook.
I think a good consultant would also be the person, not exactly the one who tells you about this example and be like, hey, think about this particular fly, and then advises people at the airport to do the same. But a good consultant would help people to walk around with those open eyes. Maybe look for stories like that on their own, or just see those opportunities. Like realize, this could be something useful. This could be something fun. Maybe I want to do something similar. Maybe I want to put up pictures of my favorite customers as well, or put something in the toilet. So I feel like as consultants, like Jim, you talked about our job, what we're currently doing. I feel like that's a lot what we do. Like we like to nudge people to come up with solutions on their own, or to be creative, or to think just a little broader, but we don't really tell what to do. We don't nudge people like do this, but we nudge them like this is how you can find your solutions.
Yeah, I think we kind of, if the big bricks of a wall are the outcomes we want, we kind of provide the mortar, right? We provide that supporting middle stuff to say, hey, let me tell you this quick story about a fly in an airport. Now let me connect that to the thing you're trying to do inside your company, or what is analogous to your world, right? And I think that's the benefit people like us have, and educational podcasts and books and all that do, is they ideally help people connect an idea that maybe has nothing to do with them, like the power of songs we know being in movie trailers for something that's not even out yet. How can a marketing department in a Fortune 500 apply that concept to whatever it is they're trying to do? And I'm sure there are lessons there. The other thing I took away from this airport example is that men are very, very easily manipulated. Because as you were saying that, I'm like, oh, I guarantee if I go to that airport, I'm going to want to, pee on the wasp. Like I totally understand that compulsion.
It makes me wonder, honestly, how they figured out where the perfect position was. Like,
too much drinking one night and a lot of experimentation,
or maybe they just try to figure out where you have the least splatter.
Oh, it's the worst job, isn't it? Someone's literally under the urinal, just what hands out, maybe just waiting for splashback, just trying to measure it that way. I don't know, but you guys have talked a lot about organizational change, and I think maybe
their parents must be proud.
Maybe I should give an organizational example as well. This really is not just for marketing. It's for, I speak about marketing a lot because I'm a marketer, but it's for all types of organizational change. So a really good example that I read about recently is this example of how do you encourage teachers to give better education? Can you nudge them one way or the other? And the instrument that the researchers tried to use to nudge them was bonuses. So we all know that if you pay someone to do something, they'll do a better job. Typically, that's typically what happens. There are some caveats there. So a lot of I had a friend round for dinner the other day. She's going into teaching, and she gets a £25,000 bursary from the government to go into a field which is slightly underfunded. So governments at the moment are paying out a lot of money to get teachers to go into these fields, except if they were to read about some of the evidence behind behavioral science, they might find a more potentially potent and effective way to give out these bonuses, because there is a study, very interesting study, which looked at teacher bonuses, and it separated teacher bonuses, and it's a real world study where teachers were given one of two bonuses. One group of teachers were given an £8,000 bonus if the students excelled at the end of the year. So that's sort of a guaranteed bonus, assuming your students do well. Another group were given £4,000 or dollars, I think it might have been dollars, at the start of the year for free. Just said, here's your $4,000, that's yours. But if your students underperform compared to the average, we will take that $4,000 back. And if they overperform compared to the average, we will give you an extra $4,000. So you'll end up with the same bonus as those in the other example. Incredibly, what happens in this study is the students' grades in maths and comprehension, which is what was being tested, was what the teachers actually taught, I should say, they went up by 10% compared to the average. And the students' scores on general comprehension tests outside of the study went up by 13% as well. So these teachers who were given a bonus up front and then told they might lose it clearly performed far better because the students had far higher grades. Now, why is this? Well, this is because of a principle called loss aversion. Loss aversion is the idea that losses feel more painful than equivalent gains. If you lose £20, I remember the time when I was 16 when I lost 20 pounds in a car park. I could not tell you the time when I've gained 20 pounds from an employer. Losses feel worse than equivalent gains. I remember the time my bike was stolen very, very vividly. I don't really think about the time that I bought it very much. So losses feel worse than equivalent gains. And of course, this means that when you give out an incentive, but there is a chance that that incentive is removed, we will work harder to make sure we don't lose that incentive than we would if we were working towards an incentive. So this, UK example, we give out £25,000 as a bursary to teachers. That, for me, seems like a lost opportunity. Why not give out £25,000, but say, or why not give out £30,000 and say, if your students underperform compared to the average over the first 5 years, we'll remove £5,000 worth of that. All you'll get there is insurance that the teachers will be decent. You'll get teachers who actually commit to the long term rather than some teachers who sign up now and then leave after a year because they've got their 25 grand. They'll have to be there for, say, 5 years in order to not lose that 5 grand, which they'll feel incentivized to do. And more importantly, the students will get taught better as well, which is, at the end of the day, the reason why you should give out incentives in the first place, not just to attract teachers. So anyway, long-winded way of saying behavioral science and nudges definitely can be applied to organizational change. It's not something just for marketing. And I think it's more interesting to even think it can improve the influential methods that we're using at the moment. You might be using an incentive in your company. Think about behavioral science and how you could perhaps improve that incentive. Maybe you could use a bit of loss aversion to make it that bit more potent.
That's a great way to begin to wrap up. And sadly, we do have to begin to say goodbye to Phil. And you mentioned Rory Sutherland earlier. That's one of my favorite episodes. I could listen to that guy talk for a solid 2 hours. You mentioned books a lot. So I'm going to take it for granted that to get good at this, you're going to have to consume some media, it sounds like. We'll put in the show notes some of the books and studies that Phil's referenced. Marge has been capturing a list. It's vast. So I think that there is a lot of material out there. There's a lot of things from Kahneman, Cialdini, and others. Check out the Nudge podcast. And in your Cat's Deli example, you made me think, if anyone goes to New York, there's a famous steakhouse there, Phil, called Keen's Steakhouse. And when you go into it, their version of what you're describing is they have these church warden pipes everywhere. And there's thousands of them, these big, long, kind of Gandalf-looking pipes. But they have names attached. Winston Churchill ate there, Stephen King, presidents, luminaries, right? And you're making me realize even 10 years ago going there, it was like, I made a great decision to come here. But the interesting thing to maybe leave us with as we think is that type of influence only works once they're already through the front door. So you can't influence somebody with that type of thing until you've already kind of got them in your restaurant or place of business. So I think that's the kind of connection to sales and marketing might be pouring them into the funnel. And then once you're getting there, you're kind of reinforcing their buying patterns. You're persuading them, you're going to like this meal. This is a good use of your time. So thank you so much for joining us, Phil. Any parting words for us or the audience?
Any last advice?
Well, if people are, last advice. Let's do another hour. No, if people are, I've mentioned a lot of books. I do think reading about this stuff is an incredibly good way to learn about it. I have just written a reading list for 2025. There are 25 books I think people should read, and I think they would benefit from reading from, and then also 5 I would encourage people to avoid. So we can drop a link to that reading list in the show notes, if that's okay with you guys, and people can go there if they want to do the reading list. And I also, that's totally free. I also have a free persuasion course where over 3 days I teach, in sort of online videos, the science of persuasion. So if anybody wants a little bit of advice, which isn't too meaty and obviously for free, I can drop a link to that in the show notes as well, so people can go there. So there's a reading list and a free persuasion course. And if you want to just give me loads of money for all those things, you're welcome to do that as well and buy one of my paid courses or do something like that. But I won't ask anyone to do that because you've just heard me on a podcast. So why would you give away your money that easily? But those 2 things I think are useful. And then also, if people want to listen to a new podcast after this, go and check out Nudge. Just search Nudge. It's the orange logo and you'll see it wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you so much. And I'll echo all that. I hope I haven't read any of the books on the 5 don't read list. I'll be checking that out. And I will say that many of Phil's paid courses are very, very affordable for the value you get. So thank you very much, Phil, for joining us. And we will talk to everyone else soon.
That is all for today. Thank you for listening. If you liked this episode, let us know by hitting that like button. Share it with friends and colleagues, sharing a message on LinkedIn, joining our warm and welcoming Discord community, or attend recordings as a virtual audience. You can find all the relevant links in the show notes. We hope you'll tune back in for the next episode of the Mastering Agility podcast.